What I'm going to talk to you about today is the well-being economy and the potential role of social enterprises within the well-being economy. But like with all of these kind of talks, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal story. And to a certain extent, this personal story helps to kind of chart where my entry into research started. And it was just with a very simple observation in the field. This was all the way back in 2010. So like many of you in the room who are doing got a career in research, you've probably done a master's degree. So back in 2010, I was doing a master's degree, not in a business school. I didn't realize business schools existed then. I was doing a master's degree in international development. And I was lucky enough to spend 6 weeks in West Africa, more specifically in the country of Ghana, looking at educational interventions in that country. And part of the various activities we were doing, on one weekend, we were sort of traveling around the country. We went to a place called Elmina, and Elmina is a sort of a very significant part of Ghana, sort of near Cape Coast, where there historically was a lot of slave trade. And there's a village near Elmina called Brenu, and this is Brenu Beach. And I happened to be walking around with the people I was on the trip with, and we were talking to some of the locals there. And one of the things that we noticed, and one of the things the locals was telling us about, was a building that we could see. And that building was branded in the brand of an international NGO, whose name I won't mention in this format. And we got talking to the locals about this NGO and what they were doing, and their aim was to provide clean water solutions for that particular village. And what the locals were telling us was that they arrived with a load of promises that they were going to do X, Y, and Z and help to deliver all of these clean water solutions. But actually, they left after about 6 months to a year of being in the village. So not only had they vacated their premises, they'd abandoned their promises. So to a certain extent, this has been a kind of core motivation for me in terms of research, is to understand why these particular types of organizations actually fulfill their promises, or in which situations do they tend to abandon their promises. So this was, I say, very interesting from a research point of view. And just by way of proof, there's me as a 21-year-old attempting to teach physical education to some children in Ghana back in 2010. But as I say, this was very interesting for me from a research point of view. So over the next couple of years, I continued to look deeper into this topic. Around about the time I was starting my PhD and looking at some different case studies. One of the cases I came across was this particular organization, and they're called Play Pumps International. And this was, again, a kind of clean water technology company trying to deliver clean water interventions across villages in sub-Saharan Africa. And the logic behind what they were doing was that this is a play pump, so this is actually a children's merry-go-round. And what happens is that when children play on the merry-go-round generates sufficient energy to actually bring clean water to the surface via a borehole. So this feels like an amazing technology. This feels like it could solve a real, crucial sort of social problem in these particular communities of access to clean drinking water. But what happened with this was really interesting, is that the organization that delivered this particular intervention took very little account of the complexities of the communities that they were trying to work in. First and foremost, they took very little account of the kind of cultural norms of the different villages that they were working in. So in some contexts, they found that it wasn't children that were using the merry-go-round, it was the women in the community who were kind of forced to use it in order to bring this clean drinking water to the surface. In other circumstances, the technology actually didn't function particularly well, so that people who were playing on the merry-go-round actually had to pump it for 27 hours a day. And I say 27 hours a day jokingly. That was actually the words that we used in one of the evaluative reports of the particular technology. So again, we have another example here of a company with grand ideas, a really interesting, sexy technology potentially that could solve a clear social problem, but not fulfilling their promises of doing that. Yet at the same time, I was also coming across much more positive examples. The most well-known one from the social enterprise world would, of course, be the work of Professor Muhammad Yunus, who set up the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, providing access to financial services for the economically disadvantaged in that country. So I was coming across some mixed stories. And as I say, to an extent, this has helped shape the research path that I've been on for the last 10 to 15 years. Once I was immersed in the world of a business school, and once I was doing a PhD, and I got to know the language of what goes on in a business school, I learned that some people call these things social enterprises. So I got to go much deeper into the literature around this and understand that there are these organizational types that exist that are designed to solve social and environmental problems whilst also generating financial revenue. And this felt to me, this is a departure from what commercial startups do, but it's also a departure from what charities and third sector organizations typically do. So social enterprises are potentially have a crucial role to play if we are to build a well-being economy. So this phrase, well-being economy, what am I talking about? What is the well-being economy and what is the promise of social enterprise within it? The well-being economy, to an extent, is a rejection of the current model of thinking. It's a rejection of the economics, the sort of dominant model of economics, whereby we think of businesses as entrepreneurs, as self-interested, rational agents trying to essentially improve their own financial circumstances. In this model, well-being is basically an externality. So if we create good companies, if we create good jobs, then what happens with those good jobs is we are able to increase our spending power, we're able to plow that back into other parts of the community, and that is how well-being happens. It happens as a result of financial wealth. This has been the model that has dominated thinking for a long time now. However, in this model, rising inequality is inevitable. Environmental degradation is also inevitable because it creates a system of winners and losers where reduction in social cohesion is also likely to occur. So the gains that we've seen in increasing GDP has only really had probably a marginal effect in increasing our well-being for most people. So what is a well-being economy rather than what is a well-being economy not? So a well-being economy lives within ecological boundaries. It respects the importance of the redistribution of wealth and opportunity. And it places well-being at the heart of policy making, and in particular, economic policy making. And as I was driving in 45 minutes ago, I was listening to the radio, and the Institute for Public Policy Research just this morning published that in the UK, we are on target to have 4 million people out of work as a result of long-term health conditions. So this is critically important, not just because it's important, we don't want people to be sick. This is going to have significant also economic implications for us. So theoretically, social enterprises provide a pathway of a solution to this. Social enterprises place well-being at the core of what they do. They reinvest what they do back into communities. They strive to solve social, environmental problems whilst also being able to pay the bills and grow their companies respectively. Social enterprises can tackle profound, deep-rooted social problems, such as unemployment, poverty, social isolation, long-term health conditions, homelessness, you name it. So is the promise of the well-being economy actually being fulfilled or not? Social Enterprise UK estimate that there are 131,000 social enterprises in this country currently. That is 1 in 42 businesses. They are contributing around £78 billion to the economy and in reinvesting at £1 billion back into their vital social missions. 75% of social enterprises are making a profit or breaking even, which is a very strong statistic. Nearly 50% are led by women, which is much, much higher than the kind of corporate equivalent. And 72% of these are living wage employers. So this feels promising, right? But there are challenges. Measuring impact of social enterprises is very difficult. Whilst if we are sort of in a more corporate setting, we know that we can measure turnover and we can understand cash flow and profit and loss and all of that really jazzy stuff. But if we want to measure well-being or reductions in poverty or improvements in long-term health conditions, that's much, much harder to grasp. The collective understanding of social enterprise remains very low. If you walk into the centre of Durham and throw that phrase into in front of your average Durham resident, they almost certainly won't know what you're referring to. And also the growth of these companies is very challenging. So delivering one particular social intervention in one part of one city is very difficult to replicate directly within another context because of the nuances, as per my play pumps example at the beginning. Then there's this question from my early observations, which is the big question. Are they fulfilling their promises? So over the last decade or so, since since going through a PhD and subsequently into a research career, I've been trying to tackle this big question alongside, obviously, lots of co-authors, some of whom might even be in this room. In an early piece of research, we tried to unpack the ethical decision-making processes of social enterprises. And one of the things that we discovered was that there's a clear difference in how some social entrepreneurs approach the businesses that they develop. So without going through the density of this in lots of detail, we identified, firstly, what's known as an arrangement approach to social problems. And this is effectively where social entrepreneurs are assuming that they understand the social issues that they are dealing with. And this can actually lead to some problems. So for example, this could be an organization that is focused on reducing poverty, where they make the assumption that if that person just gets a job at living wage level, then poverty will be reduced. However, that wouldn't take into account the multifaceted nature of poverty and all the interdependencies between different parts of our lives that are aligned to that issue. So in type 2, we see what's known as a realization approach. And this is where social entrepreneurs really like getting into the weeds and understanding the complexity of everyone's day-to-day life, and therefore the complexity of how you actually could reduce poverty. And they're constantly adapting and collaborating and developing new solutions in response to these new challenges. In a second piece of research, we were able to identify a series of factors that helps us understand competitive advantage of social enterprises. And what we mean by competitive advantage in this context is social enterprises who are simultaneously financially viable while solving the social and environmental missions that they set out to solve. So we identify that early investment is important for social enterprises. Most social enterprises are quite reluctant to access investment, but those that go for it do tend to be much, much more successful in terms of competitive advantage. Probably because it's some kind of signal to the market about where they're going with their ventures. Interestingly, we see that social enterprises seem to do very well when they go and operate in for-profit market contexts. So rather than it just being an NGO or a charity that's just decided to do a little bit of more trading, which you could class as a social enterprise, these are social enterprises moving into classic for-profit areas, and actually that is like their point of differentiation. We see that profit orientation is also very important for social enterprises. So social enterprises that, yes, Their aim is, of course, to solve a social or environmental issue where possible, but having a really clear understanding of the financial side of things, and that actually we can't solve the social issue unless this is a viable business model. And then lastly, we see the importance of local government for social enterprises. And in this particular context, this is to do with government contracting. So seeing actually working with local government as a customer. And this is a really useful form of income generation for lots of social enterprises and helps them to be much more competitive. So the final piece of research I want to talk to you about, which I think there's some lessons to learn from, refers to the role of a social investment health intervention that we evaluated in the West End of Newcastle back in 2015 and ended over the last couple of years. So this was a very complex model, very complex social enterprise model, where we have a social enterprise delivering a health intervention. This was social prescribing, if you've come across that before. They were working with beneficiaries who were experiencing long-term health conditions and spending probably too much time at their GP surgery or in hospital. So the idea was that the social prescribing intervention would help to keep them out of hospital and obviously improve their health. This was being funded by a private investor. And when the social enterprise was regarded as achieving its social outcomes, i.e. improving the long-term health conditions of people, the government then repaid the investor. So it's known as a payment by results model. But it tells us a lot about social enterprises and a lot of the complexities that they have to deal with. Social enterprises have to play games to make these contracts work. So you have a very strong financial logic to make these contracts work. And social enterprises, when dealing with beneficiaries, aren't always able to prove that they've met their aims. So what do? They find a way around it. We also found that to do social enterprise at scale, and this is literally thousands of people in the West End of Newcastle this organization works with, also requires individuals with a lot of political and social capital to make it work. And that's obviously not going to be the norm for lots of social enterprises. So being able to open doors to the right people in government, being able to open doors to the right investors. And because tracking and understanding the impact of these organizations is quite challenging, it also means that the performance management of the individuals that work within them is also particularly difficult. How do I know if you're doing your job if you're not meeting your target? That is very, very challenging when the outcome that you're being measured on is quite difficult to capture. So that's just some of the research that I've been doing for the last, 10 plus years. There are other things, but I think there's some lessons that I just want to reflect on here at the end. I believe we're at a bit of an inflection point when it comes to social enterprise and its role within the well-being economy. Social enterprises often fall between the cracks of things. So when it comes to mainstream support, startup support, that tends to be focused on commercial startups. Things like lean business models and all of this kind of stuff. It's focused on technology. It's much more orientated towards income generating companies. On the other hand, support for charities tends to focus on things like theory of change or understanding the lives of your beneficiaries rather than necessarily the business component side of things. So social enterprises sitting between those two things, it makes it very difficult to provide adequate support to them. This challenge of falling between the cracks also cuts across issues with access to finance. So if social enterprises go for formal investment, investors are much less likely to understand, why are you a social enterprise? Why aren't you just a business? Yet at the same time, when those social enterprises go to try and capture grants to help develop their work, those funding bodies may say, but you're a for-profit business. Why do you want a grant from us? So there isn't always something that's very helpful in between. So if we were to generate the well-being economy and place social enterprises at its heart, what are we doing about it? Where can we go from here? So one of the things that we are doing at Durham currently, and I'm pleased that Mareshka's in the room whilst I say this, is that we are currently in the process of developing the first accredited social enterprise training program for social enterprise startups. The idea of this is that we bring together, we respond to that falling between the cracks problem. We bring together the enterprise and the social to develop something that's really bespoke for social enterprises, that's also collaboratively developed with the sector, research informed using the latest academic tools to help support these organizations. More broadly, we must do more to support social enterprises across the board. Mainstreaming more impact investment, so investment that is designed not just for a return on investment, but a social return on investment is important. And unleashing more of that is particularly critical. I also think we need more role models. We need people like Professor Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh, who's a bit of a poster boy. We need more poster boys and poster girls for social enterprise within the UK and across the world, so that people can be inspired to do startup in a sort of socially orientated way. So all of this, I think, is part of upskilling and maturing the social enterprise sector, so it can play a real role in a well-being economy. Unlike the example I opened with, hopefully we can move towards a space where communities aren't abandoned, but where promises can be fulfilled and the well-being economy can thrive. Thank you.